Okay, I think we'll just skip through this and get our show started. So we have lots of information to cover. I always love this session. But yeah, so I'll just briefly introduce Sebastian. So Sebastian Brunemeier, he's CEO of ImmuneAGE Pharma and general partner at Healthspan Capital. He was previously at Apollo Health Ventures as a principal there, and spun out a bunch of different companies there, including Samsara. And then he went on to become a co-founder of Cambrian Biopharma, and he's also involved in the leadership at working groups at VitaDAO. So very well connected in the space, and one of the brightest minds in Longevity Biotech venture capital. So I always really enjoy hearing his perspectives and his Donald Trump impressions. And I guess we'll get started. I think we have about like 40 minutes of presentations or so, and then if you have questions, put them in the chat. But we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And without further ado, I guess I'll hand over the mic to Sebastian.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Nathan. Good to be back at LBF. It gets better every year. It's the most fantastic, incredible longevity fellowship you've ever heard. Believe me, it's incredible. So I'll go ahead and share my slides with you. Just a second here. Okay, does it look like presenter view, or is it the main full screen view?
We see presenter view right now.
All right, then I'll swap displays. How about now?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Good. All right. So I'll tell you guys about building and investing in LongBio companies. So I always use the term LongBio to try to mimic the success of the term SynBio for synthetic biology, so that investors know that there's a unique investment theme and that people who want to work in the space know that this is a distinct movement from the rest of biotech or regenerative medicine broadly. So spread the gospel of LongBio if you wish. So here's the overview of the presentation. I'll talk about my own background, why you should listen to me or consider listening to me, Healthspan Capital, the biotech ecosystem overview, a bit about DeSci, decentralized science, this new political scientific movement, and the LongBio sector, how investors diligence startups or academic assets. I think this will be important for many of you guys who are planning to build your own companies, or academics if you're professors or postdocs spinning out a company, some recommended reading and resources, and some Easter eggs at the end. So who am I? Sebastian Brunemeier. I look myself in the mirror every day and ask this question, but for the purpose of this call, I'm a biomedical scientist by training. I've spent about 10 years, more than 10 years now, in the LongBio field. Back before it became cool. Now it's nice to see that it's become fashionable. I studied molecular neuroscience in Amsterdam and biotech business management. I worked at a bunch of academic research institutions, pretty much exclusively on the biology of aging. I was in the PhD program at Oxford. I dropped out to co-found Cambrian Biopharma. Before that, I helped launch Apollo Health Ventures, which is today the largest aging-focused venture fund. It's more of a company builder than a venture fund, a traditional venture fund structure where they invest in existing companies. They tend to build them from scratch. There I founded Samsara Therapeutics, which is the largest autophagy-focused company today. We have 4 different assets in the pipeline, and the first drug is going to into the clinic this year in Parkinson's and ALS. That's based in Oxford, UK, and we're hiring if you're in England. And today, I split time between Healthspan Capital. We're the most active angel investor in the LongBio space, with my comrades Nathan and Michael and other team members, and ImmuneAGE Bio, which I'll get into a bit, where we're trying to rejuvenate the immune system at the level of hematopoietic stem cells. So here's some shout outs for some of the other organizations that I work with. Longevity Biotech Fellowship, I always give a shout out wherever I speak. So a bit about Healthspan. We invest exclusively in LongBio and regenerative medicine. We're pretty much the only fund that does this. Here are some of our excellent team members and advisors. They've been at all kinds of prestigious institutions. Check out our website for more information, including a list of our portfolio companies. Here's a partial list of some of these portfolio companies. And if you are raising capital, we would love to hear from you, or if you want to invest in our fund. So switching gears to why it's so important for us to attack the biology of aging because of this silver tsunami, this global demographic aging crisis that is, I would submit, a greater existential threat, or at least an economic challenge than, say, climate change or whatever you happen to be concerned about, because this is baked into the cake. It's 100% guaranteed. There's nothing we can do to change the demographic pyramid in anywhere in the world. So as economists say, demographics are destiny. So you can see in the year 2010, the countries in red are those where over 20% of the population are over age 65, the retirement age. And it's pretty much just Western Europe and Japan. But if you fast forward to 2050, it's pretty much the whole developed world. And we've never contended with this kind of issue before, in terms of the dependency ratio rising, as well as government budgets that rely on this sort of Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme nature for financing themselves. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news, though, is that biological immortality is physically possible. We've known this for a very long time, since the dawn of life on this planet, in fact. And it was sort of driven home for us more recently, 2012, the Nobel in iPSCs and somatic cell nuclear transfer to Gurdon and Yamanaka here. So this builds on the work of August Weismann, one of the greatest developmental biologists, who coined the term the germplasm theory. And basically, the stem cells that give rise to the sperm and egg, they are functionally immortal. They fertilize, when fertilized, become a zygote or an embryo, and then that grows into a whole human, where it's partitioned between the soma and the germline. And those germline cells maintain their identity, and they carry on through the generations. This is consistent with Richard Dawkins' view, the selfish gene, where genes are memes seeking to self-perpetuate. Here's a cool confocal image of these immortal germ cells during embryonic development in green. Here's another shot of the totipotent embryonic stem cells, which have enormous potential, but they're ethically difficult to get your hands on because you basically need an aborted fetus. But what came around was iPS technology that may allow us to benefit from this kind of biology without the ethical problems. So here's a logical proof for biological immortality. One, cells can be rejuvenated. Humans are just agglomerations of cells. Therefore, entire humans can be rejuvenated. Sounds like the fallacy of composition, but it's not if you look it up. So for the physicists, entropy was never the limit on mortality. Thermodynamic energy can be input into the system to live on. Lifespan is an evolved property of organisms, and it's encoded in the genome. So mice, it's 3 years, humans, 75, trees, 5,000. The only difference is the genome sequence. And so when we're able to tweak that with precision, the sky is the limit on lifespan and health span. So geroscience is a new paradigm. I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but at the turn of the 20th century, nobody would have believed you if you said that people are not going to die from infectious disease very much anymore, because pretty much everybody was dying from bacterial infections. And some doctors basically invented a handful of antibiotics. There's a good book about this called Demon Under the Microscope, about 19th century Germany and the emergence of the pharmaceutical industry. And it changed the paradigm in just a few decades. Penicillin was brought about in time for World War II, and it saved probably tens of millions of lives. So this is kind of an analogy for what we're dealing with, which is that paradigm shift where we bring aging under medical control rather than it being the leading cause of death. So here are some of the interesting pathways in geroscience. You guys will know these from the Hallmarks of Aging paper, which has been expanded recently. Here are some interventions a little bit out of date from Apollo Ventures' genetic and pharmacological interventions in their quantum of lifespan extension. Here are some of my personal favorites. I will draw your attention to heterochronic bone marrow transplant. This is an area that I'm personally working on right now. So let's do a little bit of a landscape of the space. So here we have the invincible Nathan Cheng's data set at longevitylist.com, a great resource. And it estimates exponential growth in LongBio companies. I would say, with a caveat, many of these companies would not qualify by strict definition of LongBio, like with respect to lifespan extension data. but they're calling themselves LongBio companies, right? So it's becoming sort of a theme or a trend. Here's a snapshot of what this database looks like. You guys should all sign up for the Longevity Market Cap newsletter if you haven't already. Here's some of the groups that are investing in this space, some that I'm affiliated with or help launch, but there are several others that are coming into the space. Many of them are not exclusively focused on longevity, which is a shame because we want as much capital and talent going into LongBio as possible, but they are preaching the gospel at the very least. So here's a social proof slide of the appeal to ethos, some of the smart cookies in the space. Peter Thiel was really one of the OGs, one of the first. Jeff Bezos has splashed onto the scene, but many other prominent figures who you will know from venture land. I'll call out Vitalik Buterin as well, who sponsored Zuzalu, which was this pop-up city which had a sort of longevity orientation to it, and he's done a lot to spread the word, as well as Balaji Srinivasan, who, wow, I'm ashamed to say I didn't include on this slide, even though he's my favorite thinker at the moment, and he's actually invested in ImmuneAGE, I'm happy to say. So here are some of the companies. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but just some of the more prominent ones. Some are publicly listed. The publicly listed ones are not really LongBio, mostly in my view, but they sort of refer to themselves as such. Privately held are a lot more sort of straight down the middle, bona fide LongBio. Here are some of the ones that I've co-founded, as well as some that Apollo has co-founded, and you can see it on their website. All right, so stepping back, an overview of the biopharma machine. So this I call a wiring diagram of the biomedical economy. It is a crucifix, but I don't mean to endorse any particular religion other than Pastafarianism, which of course I'm a very zealous adherent of the flying spaghetti monster religion. And vitalism, of course. So I've pledged my firstborn and all of my young blood to the vitalism movement. So we'll zoom in here. Where does the money come from? It ultimately all comes from the public, one way or the other, through taxes. It goes to the NIH and research institutes. A lot of that money is squandered because it's kind of an inefficient way to do research. We can get into that. Some of my other talks, like on the DSci Berlin conference talk on YouTube, I get into why that is. But some of the money goes into capital markets, so risk capital, like public markets as well as private markets. The private market investors are limited partners. They come into venture capital funds. The venture capital funds can sometimes spin out these companies, or they invest in companies that have already been launched by founders. So ultimately, the proximal customer is big pharma. They acquire pretty much all innovation in this space. It's pretty rare, probably less than 5% of companies actually commercializing their own drugs, just because it's so capital intensive. And it's actually by design. It allows this sort of cartel of 20 big pharmas to basically derive a lot of the profits in the sector by making it so hard for smaller companies to comply with the regulatory requirements. So big pharma is the proximal customer, but ultimately the customer are the payers and individuals. So big pharma, as well as biotechs, rely on CROs, contract research organizations, to do preclinical and clinical stage research. They provide the data to the regulators like FDA or EMA, and the payers also review like Medicare or insurance companies. Sometimes the drugs will be approved, but the insurance companies will say this drug doesn't really work, like what happened with Aduhelm, the amyloid beta drug that didn't really work. And then it's $1 trillion a year on brand, on patent pharmaceutical market in the US and Europe. So some more bad news, sorry to say, is that big pharma is burning investors' capital. So their weighted average cost of capital is greater than their internal rate of return. So they're losing money when they spend money on internal R&D because the incentive structure is messed up and they're too big and bureaucratic and any number of reasons. So they rely on external innovation, which is actually beneficial for those of us on this call whose job is to launch these biotech companies and invest in them. So big pharma has historically been asleep at the wheel. This quote is from Jürgen Drews, president of R&D at Roche, one of the more sophisticated big pharmas in Switzerland. He said, biotech is taking up what pharma is neglecting, carrying out future-directed research, creating the conditions for the discovery of new classes of medicines that attack more directly the root causes of disease. What could be more at the root than aging itself? David Baltimore, president of Caltech, Nobel laureate in immunology, said, regarding the biotech revolution in the 90s, pharma was asleep at the wheel, unable to understand the profound opportunities of molecular biology. And that created space for companies like like Genentech to be created. And Genentech was one of the greatest venture capital returns of all time, certainly in biotech. So there's some more good news, which comes from Andrew Lowe's group at MIT. Andrew Lowe has gone through some of the data, and he looked at the top 30 best-selling drugs in the year 2000, and most of them came from big pharma internal pipelines. So only 13% came from small biotechs or academic spinouts. But then you fast forward to 2018, that's probably even more the case now. The ones in blue are all from academia or biotech rather than big pharma internal pipelines of the best-selling drugs. So the problem is we have a serious bottleneck in qualified founders as well as investors in biotech, and especially in LongBio. And so that's why we're all here today, is to sort of create this cult of helping each other to advance this field. And I firmly believe that, you know, a small group of extremely motivated people can achieve really profound outsized results. I think it was Margaret Mead who said something to that effect. But right now we have this venture creation bottleneck. Even in the US, even in these big cities like Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, there's still tons of assets sitting on the shelf and not enough people to advance them and not enough capital, much less, you know, referring to the rest of the world, Europe and Asia, and et cetera. Okay, and then some more good news. Andrew Lowe has calculated that the rate of approval for new drugs is actually rising. And he attributes this rate of approval increase to more academic drug discovery, biotech spinouts, and new modalities like gene therapy, where we know the molecular basis of disease, or targeting rare genetic diseases where the pathology is clear. And so he's written about this in a number of venues. He kind of inspired the creation of BridgeBio, which is this multi-asset disco structure company, this hub and spoke style company that's valued at $6 billion or something today in the rare disease space. And that inspired us at Cambrian to do the same thing, but for longevity. And so we have, you know, over 10 assets in the pipeline, this sort of diversified portfolio. Okay, so switching gears to DeSci, decentralized science. This is a revolution in the making. It'll take some decades, but mark my words, it will change the face of science, full stop. It's basically getting crypto capital into the hands of talented people everywhere, even if you're not affiliated with an academic institution or you're not in one of these primary cities where biotech occurs. We want science to occur wherever it makes sense. And we don't want these barriers to entry. We don't want this cartelization and this formation of dogma, as often occurs when it's very centralized, determining who gets funded, like NIH, for example. So here's a snapshot of some of the groups in the space. You can get access to this presentation a little bit later and dive into any of these slides. I'll kind of whip through them pretty quickly in the interest of time. And this is actually out of date. The movement's been growing really rapidly just in the last 3 years or so since it launched. We have, you know, probably doubled the number of organizations involved. So what's the definition of DeSci? DeSci is a new paradigm to discover, disseminate, fund, and execute scientific research without relying on governments, big corporations, or centralized institutions. You can take the IP resulting from this research, put it on chain, fractionalize it, and liquidly trade it in a manner more transparent than the current IP market structure, where it's very hard to license these assets. And companies and labs can also be financed on chain. So the decentralized approach mitigates the enforcement of scientific dogma and perverse incentives in both industry and academia, which have failed in their obligations to public health and scientific progress, especially since the 1970s. So now on the nuts and bolts of investor diligence for geroscience assets. So what does the process of new co-formation look like? Well, you look for the new IP. It doesn't have to be something that's patented, but something that would yield something patentable. This could be a platform for discovering new medicines or something like that. You do preclinical diligence on the science. So, you know, is this target a relevant one, or this animal model, or this mechanism of action, et cetera? Come up with an IP strategy. So, you know, are you going to get a composition of matter patent on this molecule? What clinical indications will you pursue, et cetera? Development plans, a budget, Gantt chart. You do medchem, it's a small molecule, your experimental protocols. Clinical and regulatory strategy, it's never too early to have that. It'll probably change in time, but it's good to have that already sorted out. And then you actually negotiate the formation of the NewCo with the tech transfer office if there's a university involved, and then the raising of capital. It's out of date. So here are the general pillars that we look for. So the pharmacology, so the mechanism of action, target ID, therapeutic index, chemical properties, geroscience, median, maximum lifespan extension, whether that animal model is well validated. The phenotype of aging reversal, does it make the animals look younger in some way? You know, physical function, cognitive function, histology level, et cetera. Is it targeting one of the hallmarks of aging or one of the future hallmarks of aging? A bit about the lab itself, the IP position, and the track record of the team involved. All of that comes together in the translational attractiveness. There's a big difference between something that's great science and something that's ready to be spun out into a drug. So how do we define a LongBio company? I would humbly submit that the bread and butter of the longevity field is, simply put, longevity or lifespan, especially healthy lifespan, right? So you can extend someone's lifespan who has cancer by giving them chemo, but it will shorten their healthy lifespan, all else being equal, because it'll kill off their stem cells and so forth. So a traditional chemotherapy might extend lifespan of someone with a particular disease, but it would not extend lifespan in the general population, especially if given prophylactically. So we look for lifespan extension in some model organisms, ideally mice. If you don't yet have that, sometimes it can take a while to get, at least have some evidence that this mechanism of action or this pathway extend lifespan. If you do not have this lifespan data yet, you're not yet a LongBio company. And I would suggest that investors in the space and founders in the space whose main objective is not money, but to extend lifespan, should not waste your time on stuff that does not have strong evidence that it would extend lifespan. I mean, it sounds obvious, but there's so many companies out there that are claiming to be longevity, and they don't have that key longevity data yet. So you can analyze a Kaplan-Meier curve in this way. You guys are many of you are scientists, so you know how to do this already, but it's really straightforward. The median lifespan delta and the maximum lifespan delta. Sourcing deals. So if you're seeking to get the word out about your company or you're looking for deals to do, the journals are underrated. People just don't spend that much time reading. Really should just spend more time reading these journals. The conferences are also pretty good. You got the science conferences and the business conferences. Talk to tech transfer office. Many of them are not that competent, but some of them are actually really good, especially oftentimes younger people who haven't been there for that long. Before they've been corrupted, their minds have been corrupted by the incompetence. Grant databases like the NIH Grant Home can be good as well, as has been validated by an NIH committee. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Some of the less incremental, more moonshot stuff would not pass muster. Inbound deal flow as an investor, you'll get that eventually. Patent database, if you're a masochist and are able to tolerate the way that patents are written in such a dry way. But really, it's a wide open playing field. So like as an investor or as a founder, I've been in this for years, and I rarely sort of butt heads with somebody who's like seeking the same asset, seeking to out-license the same asset, or the deal is super full. I mean, there's just the round is full. There's just not that many people actively in this space. Like, for example, a friend of mine who worked at Pfizer, she said at Pfizer, they only had 12 people to cover all of the universities in the United States and Canada, which is kind of insane, right? So, and that's one of the biggest of the big pharmas. So there are not many adults in the room, I like to say. We like to think that there are like smart, wise people who are like sorting all of this out and planning all of this and deciding which medicines are the best ones to develop. It's absolutely not the case. The history of medicine and pharma, at least in the last half century, has been one of just abject like incompetence. I'll give you an example. This is a documentary called Breakthrough about Jim Allison, the immune oncology pioneer who co-developed the CTLA-4 checkpoint inhibitors. And it's an amazing documentary. It literally brought a tear to my eye when I was on the plane watching it. And he basically spent like 10 years trying to get pharma's attention, trying to get pharma interested in immune oncology checkpoint inhibitors, and they just kept brushing him off. And similarly, we've known for a century that the immune system mediates tumor immune surveillance since Coley's toxins. So there's this Dr. Coley who in like 1910 injected people with ground up bacteria, and it would elicit a sepsis-like cytokine release. and that would sometimes kick their immune system into gear to eliminate their tumors. So we've known about this for a century. Another example is cancer metabolism, like Otto Warburg back in 1920. He wasn't some no-name person. He was a Nobel laureate. He was like the most famous German scientist. And yet, it took a century before it became hot. So there's just a lot that's sitting on the shelf. So that's the message I would leave you with. Just because you come across a good idea doesn't mean that someone's already done it. Okay, so here are some books that are a great start. Entrepreneur's Guide to a Biotech Startup. That's really short. It's like 100 pages. It's a really good overview. The Spark Guide to Academic Drug Discovery for academics in particular. And then Genentech, The Beginnings of Biotech by Sally Smith Hughes. This is kind of a fun story about, what it's like to launch a wacky scrappy biotech startup that later became one of the most successful in the world. Here are some other resources that I recommend. So newsletters, biotech podcasts, broader news, neuroscience journals, other good journals, and some of these overview texts just for venture broadly. I have a Google Drive folder that contains many of these sacred texts, these tomes, and I will bestow upon you that sacred knowledge, the occult knowledge, if you make a young blood sacrifice and human breast milk sacrifice, and you DM me on LinkedIn, and I'll send you the link. Okay. So one way that I sort of look for these assets is a structured process. I have this sort of checklist that looks at all of these different parameters and tries to rank these projects head to head. That's a little out of date. One that's a really good concept that not a lot of academics think about very often, but pharmacologists do, or toxicologists in particular, is the therapeutic window. You need a very large delta between the toxic effect and your therapeutic effect. So this is one of the things that I often ask academics to do that I'm really surprised they don't do that often. There's an extended checklist that goes into a lot more detail. I can share that with you. And I also have a little spreadsheet about the actual step-by-step guide on what you need to do to launch a biotech company, from the legal aspect to, the licensing negotiations and everything you could want to know. So, okay, IP diligence. This is a whole world unto itself, but IP law is an art, not a science. You want to plan for success that your patent will be disputed. So you're on the market or late stage clinical and some pharma tries to dispute your patent. You want to prepare for success. So ideally you have a new chemical entity, a molecule that has not been described previously. You've synthesized it anew, as well as its methods of use. And eventually you can do a formulation approach too. Don't file the patent too early, and I'll double down on this later. You want to wait until the last minute to file, unless it's an extremely competitive target or chemical space. Generally speaking, one of the things that I see that kills startup companies the most is they filed the patent too early because the academic wanted to publish the paper. And in order to publish, you need to file a patent. Otherwise, you invalidate your own patentability because it's prior art and you've eliminated the novelty. So it'll get filed way too early and then it goes stale. And so don't do that. Your first patent submission is usually rejected by US Patent Office or European Patent Office. That's normal, don't worry. But then again, not everything is always ideal. You may not be able to get a composition of matter patent for some reason. Usually you can, but for some reason you can't. If the patent is over 5 years old, you can develop a new improved analog, formulation, salt form, crystal polymorph, and or method of use. And you want to create a thicket of patents to forestall competitors. Oh, another cool thing. One reason why some of the best-selling drugs right now are biologics is because they're sort of perma-patented, because it's so hard to make a biosimilar. And this is a huge problem, actually, for the healthcare system. But this is one thing that makes your company more attractive to pharma partners if you're doing biologics R&D. That's especially true for cell therapies. But the benefit of that in cell therapy is not often outweighed by the difficulty of manufacturing cell therapies consistently. Gene therapy is still somewhat in the middle between those. So biologics like antibodies or peptides are a good way to go from an IP perspective. Right. So to just hammer home on this, academics often prematurely file patents in order to publish. Do not patent your best compounds or clinical candidates. Publish an analog and hold the best one back. Otherwise, your IP will expire too early. So many companies have died on this hill, on this sword. Another thing you can do if you're an overachiever is make a RNPV model. You can do that probably later in the company when you know what your clinical indications are going to be. But basically, the premise is something that you should already be thinking about, which is how long will it take for you to reach cash flow, and what's the probability at each clinical stage of failure? And you can calculate that in a sort of quick and dirty way with your clinical therapeutic area. So oncology versus cardiovascular. Oncology has a 4% success rate. Cardiovascular is like 20%. So you can integrate that into your financial model to figure out what the value of the asset would be. And you can calculate it in this kind of way, and you basically figure out what is the market size for your indication of interest, the market penetration, what you're going to charge for it, and then you discount back in time using a discount rate for how many years it would take to actually get to the market. And that tells you what the net present value is as of today. So money now is worth a lot more than money in the future, in part because of inflation and also the time preference of money. You also early on want to develop a Gantt chart for your company as well as a budget. It can be relatively high level. This is actually kind of granular, but just, say a 2 to 3 year timeline for how you expect to use the money and the milestones. Right. So the legit LongBio typology, this is a way that we can kind of classify companies by their grade. It's like grade A beef, or like restaurants with their hygiene ratings. It's kind of like this. And so before I get to that, why is this kind of metric, this tool important? Why is self-regulation quality control important? Exhibit A, Theranos. This was a case where she raised, I don't know how much, close to $1 billion or something. And it turned out that it was scientifically just not viable. But she had everybody on board. And this is the kind of thing we need to avoid in the LongBio space. We cannot really afford some high-profile failures and frauds because it will set back the whole space. This happened in gene therapy too. So there was this death of one patient, Jesse Gelsinger, a young man, and this was with a lentiviral gene therapy back in the 90s, and it set back the entire gene therapy field for probably a decade or more. So we really need to avoid this happening. Another example is the amyloid hypothesis. So this was a case that I definitely recommend everybody study. You can go on Stat News, this great publication that talks about the maddening saga of an Alzheimer's cabal which thwarted progress for decades. So all these high-profile academic scientists and government bureaucrats were sweeping under the rug evidence against their favorite amyloid hypothesis about the idea that there's this one protein, amyloid beta, that caused Alzheimer's. And it turned out that was not the case. And FDA approved a couple drugs anyway recently for political reasons, but they hardly work and they're going to be very expensive. So we need to avoid over-indexing on one paradigm or one thesis. We need to let 1,000 flowers bloom to the extent possible. Okay, so the typology in its current form looks like this. So type 1, you've got a drug-like compound that extends wild-type mouse healthy lifespan by 10% or more, even when given to mice that are already old, over 12 months of age. Rapamycin is one example of this. This is very rare and valuable. This is really the kind of thing, the high-powered, jet fuel that we're looking for. Type 2, same thing, but given to mice when they're young. So astaxanthin SGLT2 inhibitors are examples of this. Same thing, but less than 10% lifespan, like metformin, which is, I'd say, quite overrated as a geroprotective drug. Only 5% lifespan extension. And that's at the perfectly optimized dose in mice because it's a U-shaped curve. So if you start to give a little too much metformin, it becomes toxic and shortens their lifespan because metformin's mechanism of action is that it's a mitochondrial toxin. Not to say that these are not worth taking, or at least in some instances, but those are not really the thing that we jump out of bed in the morning about. These results should be reproduced by 3 independent labs or the NIA ITP program, which is kind of the gold standard. Type 4, the mechanism of action has been shown genetically or pharmacologically to extend lifespan over 10% in wild-type rodents, like autophagy, senolysis, telomere extension, heterochronic bone marrow transplant. Type 5, the mechanism of action is a hallmark of aging, but with less than 10% healthy lifespan extension in wild-type mice, like Yamanaka reprogramming or inhibiting inflammation. Everyone has a bee in their bonnet. Everyone is really excited for epigenetic reprogramming, and yet we don't really have much lifespan data at all. And so we should not allocate literally billions of dollars to it until we at least have some proof of principle that we can get robust lifespan extension with this approach. I think it's very promising, but maybe just a little bit out of proportion with the amount of capital and attention it's gotten lately at the expense of other approaches. Type R, something else entirely, regenerative medicines lacking lifespan data, but have compelling data for enhanced function and health span later in life. If you could cure osteoarthritis or degenerative disc disease or sarcopenia or something like that, the effect on lifespan may not be huge, although I think it would be there. But that's the kind of thing that just we should be doing, period. And it's the kind of thing that has a relatively limited side effect profile. So it's not like a chemotherapeutic, which is going to accelerate your aging. If anything, these regenerative therapies will be neutral to positive for lifespan. That's my view. And for any long biomedicine should have multimorbidity reduction, MMR, as my colleague James Pyer called it, and the potential to be a preventative medicine that enhances resilience before disease becomes severe. It's often said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And the current regulatory system, the reimbursement system, is not well equipped to incentivize the discovery and production of preventative medicines, which is really one of the biggest problems we face. So to give you an example, a drug that can treat lung fibrosis is not a geroprotector unless it can be label expanded to other indications or is safe enough to be a prophylactic, right? So lung fibrosis, it's often an age-related disease, but the drug won't necessarily extend lifespan or prevent many other age-related diseases. Okay, give a shout out for Cambrian. If you guys want to launch a company and you want to kind of do it within the aegis, the umbrella of a larger organization, you can get in touch with Cambrian, as well as Apollo Ventures. Some of the team members at Cambrian has been growing rapidly. You can check out the website for more information. Another shout out, Samsara Therapeutics, a company I founded with Apollo. This is in Oxford, UK. They're hiring biochemists. It is an autophagy company. So autophagy, you guys will know, when you do caloric restriction or exercise, one of the main reasons it's good for you and extends lifespan is autophagy, the cellular recycling process. And actually, genetic enhancement of autophagy is sufficient to extend lifespan in mice by about 15%. They don't get fat if you ever feed them. They maintain muscle mass and cognitive function way later. So autophagy is really a very attractive approach. So we have this platform called LysoSeeker that uses a whole lot of methods to identify new mechanism of action autophagy enhancers that are superior to the serendipitously discovered autophagy enhancers previously. So to my amazement, when I launched Samsara, there had never been a systematic effort to do phenotypic screening and find new autophagy enhancers, even though we knew how important this mechanism is in aging. So here's some of the team members around the table. Here's some of our science team and some of our rockstar scientific advisory board members. If you're in England and interested in getting involved, get in touch. Here's the clinical pipeline going into clinic in Parkinson's and ALS, and we got a Michael J. Fox grant for that. Okay, so my own work presently is focused on ImmuneAGE Bio. We're the first drug discovery platform for immune system rejuvenation. So I'd been in the space for 10 years. I thought I'd seen it all. And I realized that nobody at the time was working on systematically searching for rejuvenators of immune function at the level of hematopoietic stem cells or other immune cells like T cells. Now there are a couple efforts doing that, thankfully. So what is the hematopoietic stem cell, the HSC? It is at the apex of the immune system. It gives rise to all of the immune cells as well as your red blood cells. They are stored in within the bone marrow, where precious cells would be stored. It's like how the precious squishy brain is stored inside of the skull to protect it. Well, other precious cells are stored inside of hard encasings like the bone marrow. So here's some of the team members that I'm fortunate to have around the table. They've been at all the prestigious places in academia and biopharma, et cetera. And I'll just give you a teaser about what the sort of long-term vision is here. So this is what we call the immune system reboot, kind of like an oil change in your car, but for your immune system. So we mobilize HSCs in the peripheral blood, which is routinely done today in bone marrow transplants all over the world with an injection. Hook you up to an apheresis machine. We can do a quality control step before reimplanting the cells, by the way, which is not done today in bone marrow transplant. We do ex vivo expansion of HSCs. So we have a method of achieving 1,000-fold expansion of HSCs, maintaining stemness, which is the world record by far. Then we rejuvenate with these proprietary cocktails ex vivo. We incubate the cells in these cocktails of molecules. And then we reinfuse into the bloodstream and they home into the bone marrow. It's pretty amazing how they know how to do that. They know where home is. And, we weren't the first to come up with this idea. It's an idea whose time has come. There was a paper in the journal Geroscience by Primoz Rozman about the life extension potential here. And the analogy that really sticks with people is the ship of Theseus. So it's a Greek myth about the concept of continuity, where if you slowly replace one piece of wood in the ship at a time, when does it become a new ship? So that's what we aim to do here at ImmuneAGE, is gently replace the immune system periodically, maybe every couple of years, and just like a tune-up or an oil change in your car. In the near term, we have other clinical indications that are sort of closer at hand, like, for example, patients who receive chemotherapy. When you get chemo, it kills off your immune system, it kills your fast-dividing cells. And so what if we banked some of these cells pre-chemo and then reinfuse the cells post-chemo to prevent the acute problems of chemo, like anemia and neutropenia and infections? But also the holy grail would be to prevent the tumor relapse, which is so common in many cancer types, as well as the immune senescence related post-chemo complications, where chemotherapy really does cause accelerated aging. You can basically almost mimic progeria with DNA damaging chemotherapies. So this is something where, the science is in, there's no like scientific barrier to doing this. Some people are already doing this over the counter today, but they don't get insurance reimbursement, and there are ways to improve it further. Okay, so we're almost done, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So maybe hold your questions. And this is where I get a little bit spicier. So this is a new sort of kick that I'm on, which is sort of libertarian idea of creating our own free city-states and eventually countries, and how we can facilitate medical freedom in so doing. So these are two books, some of my favorite books of the year that you should definitely put on your list. Network State by Balaji Srinivasan. He's a genius, and he wrote this book about how we basically create a community online, say around longevity or around crypto or around whatever interest you have, get many thousands of people involved, and then you start advocating for political changes. And then eventually you materialize in a physical place and live together in a community, kind of like what we did with Zuzalu, kind of like what we're doing in Prospera, kind of like what we aim to do in the Vitalism movement. Another good book is The Sovereign Individual. The foreword was written recently by Peter Thiel. And this book was written in 1997, and it predicted crypto. It predicted migration arbitrage or investment migration, remote work. It predicted the loss of public trust in institutions like the media and the government and et cetera. And then, of course, Art of the Deal, the most fantastic book ever. Better than the Bible. Jesus told me so. Believe me, it's incredible. I don't endorse Trump, but I do think he's entertaining. Right. So here's an example of the Startup Cities movement. This is compiled by my friend and colleague and investor, Nicholas Anzinger, who runs Infinitive Fund, a venture fund investing in these startup cities and startup city incubated companies that can benefit from operating in regulatory regimes in these startup cities that are much more amenable to just freedom and innovation. So here's a list of some of these organizations, places where people are going to live. It's kind of like a technology-enabled commune, but eventually has aspirations to be its own city-state. So like imagine if we could build our own Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dubai, under these special economic zones where we have the ability for basically individual freedom, low taxes, protection of civil rights, and in a straightforward, like well-functioning government and immigration system. What could we achieve with that? So I'll let you think about that a little more. So why do we need to escape from these legacy countries? Governments are becoming more authoritarian. They're instituting central bank digital currencies so they can see all of your transactions and shut off your bank account if they don't like you. Taxes are rising. They're not going down in the West. Inflation is another form of taxation. They're doing lockdowns, digital IDs, and human rights violations in not just China or Russia, but in US, Canada, elsewhere. And I think it's just going to get worse. So you can try to vote, you can try to stick around and fix the system, or you can exit, which I think is more powerful of a statement. You vote with your feet, like people defecting the Soviet Union, for example. So people are doing that now, millionaire migration, and not just millionaires, but normies as well. And they're going to places where there's more freedom, economic and civil rights, and also better weather. So you can kind of see where people are leaving and where people are going. Portugal's popular. UAE is super popular. Singapore, UAE and Singapore, they have their significant downsides. So there's room to create a new startup city state, one focused on longevity. And we'll get to that in just a sec. So call out Singapore, UAE, and Portugal as relatively hot locations. Switzerland too, but Switzerland's expensive and cold. Right. So this comes from, I think, from the Cato Institute or similar, where there's a pretty strong correlation between economic freedom and personal freedom. It's hard to say, chicken or egg. I think I think economic freedom gives rise to more personal freedom. But anyway, you can see, at the top of the list are countries like Switzerland, where the government is relatively restrained in its ability to steal from you or tell you, what to do with your business, and prosperity results. So how does that tie in with medical freedom? FDA is one sort of sclerotic, inefficient organization. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, wrote, "Was the government to prescribe to us our medicine and diet, our bodies would be in such keeping as our souls are now." They were very poetic back then, and he was prophetic in his predictions. So there are all kinds of weird shenanigans happening with regulators, FDA and EMA, approving drugs they shouldn't and not approving drugs they should because of this process of regulatory capture and the revolving door. Right. So if you like this kind of thing, you should come to our LongBio and DeSci conference, November 17th to 19th in Prospera, the Caribbean island of Roatan off the coast of Honduras, which is a beautiful Caribbean island. And we will have a lot more to discuss about this. And then separately, also in Roatan, we'll be doing this gathering called Vitalia, January, February timeframe, where we will be living there, kind of like Zuzalu, this experimental 2-month pop-up city, but with a LongBio flavor. And so you can apply to attend, and I think that will be really a lot of fun. Right. So how do you get to Roatan? There are a bunch of flights from the US, direct flights, no big deal. And so why do we want to do, what else do we want to do in Roatan, in Prospera? So regenerative medicine and medical tourism are booming. You can get stem cell injections, and they work really well for injuries and all kinds of diseases. But the regulatory regime in the US and Europe is really, really slow. They're just starting to get some of these cell therapies approved, like MSC cell therapies, but they're super expensive. And so people are going abroad and getting these therapies, but there's no major hub. So they're spread out all over the world. So what if we could create one hub with a really clear regulatory regime and its own little mini FDA that is certificatory rather than prohibitive? So in Prospera, we have control of the civil code, so the laws, as well as the tax code and business code, et cetera. So we are setting up our own regulatory agency in Prospera. There are already some clinics there, and we'll get into that. So this is a design of what this regenerative medicine clinical hub will look like. We already have a bunch of buildings there. We plan to do gene therapy. This is already being done by groups like MiniCircle. Cell therapy already being done by clinics on the island, as well as tissue engineering, which is a little more fancy. Here's some pictures of some of the Prospera buildings already and a new residential building they're putting up. Here's the master plan. So this sort of futuristic city in the Caribbean, where we will have hopefully like a year-round Zuzalu type situation, hub, Mecca. Here, there's already a really high quality regenerative medicine clinic. They've done thousands of procedures. It's run by Glenn Terry, who was the head of the Olympics medical committee. So, all of those people who are trying to take steroids and not get caught for it. Well, he is he was the guy who was in charge of that committee, and he's provided a whole lot of cell therapies, regenerative medicine, and other procedures in the island for years. So a bit about his background, and he's coordinating clinical trials on the island. So this will basically allow us to do proof of concept studies, clinical research, really quickly and cheaply to get proof of concepts done without all of the regulatory burdens of these legacy countries. And so we're setting up our own sort of regulatory entity there that doesn't prohibit you from doing anything, but we certify things that we think are a good idea. And that's the difference between FDA or EMA, where FDA and EMA, the government says, we don't care if you and your doctor want to do a therapy until we have approved it and you have paid millions of dollars in fees to us and you've spent tens or hundreds of $1 million in clinical trials to our satisfaction, which pretty much only big pharma can afford to do in the late stage, then you are not allowed to use that therapy at all. That's the current paradigm. And so, it's the same with psychedelics. We've known the benefits of psychedelics in neuropsychiatric disorders for a very long time, and yet they were prohibited. They were legal. So we don't really like that prohibitive approach. We believe that we should let people, their doctors and their advisors and their insurers decide what therapy is best for them. So that's the paradigm we're setting up. Okay, so just to finish off the last couple slides, shout out to VitaDAO. You guys should get involved. You probably already know VitaDAO. Molecule, which is building these BioDAOs, not just in longevity, but in all kinds of other topics. And LabDAO, which is setting up the physical infrastructure to execute decentralized science. And this other prize that I helped launch, the Hypothesis Prize, where basically you write an essay proposing some novel, great idea. It doesn't have to be yours, it can be from the literature back in the day, but something that people aren't actively talking about as an area of research, and you can get 20 grand if you win the competition, and smaller prizes for second and third place. So you go through the literature, maybe you read it in your native language and you uncover something. Like I mentioned how cancer metabolism and Otto Warburg has been known for a century, but it took about a century before we really started to apply it in the clinic, or the same with immune oncology or heterochronic parabiosis. Before Arena Conboy and Tom Rando and team revived that method, it had been performed a century before. So there's so much sitting on the shelf in time and in space that we should definitely be paying people to search out. And then finally, our dictator, one of which is on the call, Nathan Chang, is launching this new religious political movement, this cult called Vitalism. And you guys should all join. And they just did a conference in Rhode Island. So this is a way to basically create a hub within the United States to advance the interests of longevity. And the United States, it may be an empire in decline, but these declines are slow and it's still the best in terms of biotech. So we really should have a foothold, a beachhead inside of the United States for those who can't, up and move to a Caribbean island or Switzerland or Singapore or something like that. Right. So that is everything I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening and happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Okay, thanks a bunch, Sebastian. That was fantastic. And I swear we are very benevolent dictators. He's kidding about the whole dictator part. Okay. Cool. And we never use that word. But yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or we can also get you to come off mute. Oh my gosh. Let's see. We have one question from Gareth. Did you want to ask your question actually?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yep.
We can hear it. Awesome.
Yeah, so my question was, because you're a LongBio focused, I'm always curious about whether a drug like semaglutide or atorvastatin would count as a longevity drug, and would you spot those drugs and invest in companies developing them, given your LongBio focus?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a very high standard for drugs that I think are good. And semaglutide, it works in the short term for a lot of people, but you lose muscle mass and you regain the weight when you come off it, and you have a metabolic set point that hasn't been shifted, and you regain the weight after having lost the muscle mass. So it's not really ideal. But the jury's still out. I mean, in the population that is like desperately obese, I think it makes sense, but it's not a geroprotective drug. Like if you gave it to someone who's metabolically well, as is the case with metformin, it would probably do a lot more harm than good, right? So metformin is good for people who have metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, et cetera, fatty liver. But for metabolically well people, I think it would be net detrimental. Same with semaglutide and the GLP-1s. And pharma knows this. So, I have a friend from Novo Nordisk. I have friends at many of these pharmas, and these pharmas they're already looking for replacements because they know that this is not going to last. They know that it was this huge hype cycle, and it was kind of like threads from Facebook versus Twitter/X. It was just, there was huge interest at first and uptake, but it's not the holy grail. As for the statins, like atorvastatin was the best-selling drug of all time, until the COVID vaccines. 120 billion lifetime sales from Pfizer, and it was like the fifth, or it wasn't even the first statin. First statins were from Takeda, Mevastatin. Anyway, so I am not really a huge statin head. I think statins make sense for familial hypercholesterolemia, and in some rare cases, but the number needed to treat for statins is 1 in 500. And so, and they have fairly significant side effects. We need cholesterol. Like, cholesterol makes up cell membranes all over the body. It's really important in the brain. It's important for the synthesis of sex hormones. So I'm not a cholesterol disbeliever. So for those two drugs, I wouldn't classify them as geroprotectors. A geroprotector has to extend lifespan when given prophylactically to people who are already relatively well, and it's, in part because I want to use them myself, right? Like, I'll do everything I can to maintain my health as long as possible, and I want a drug that's actually going to help me and the people who are already optimizing longevity, stuff that will go a step further. And that's why I really like regenerative medicine, because you're literally putting something into the body that wouldn't otherwise be there, like new stem cells that can fix problems. So hopefully does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much.
Cool.
So
Okay.
yeah, thanks for your question, Gab. Divya, did you want to ask your question? Okay, maybe I'll just. Oh, Divya,
Gabriel?
Divya,
No,
Divya.
sorry.
Oh, okay. If not, I'll just read it. So yeah, Divya was asking about if you could suggest how IP strategy works for cell therapies.
Yeah, it's a broad question. It's still kind of being worked out because cell therapies are pretty new. You can always fall back on the composition of matter approach. So this is what T cell therapy does. They engineer an artificial CAR construct, chimeric antigen receptor, that they add into these T cells, and that's where their key IP is located. But you can also get away without it. So you can have IP around the manufacturing process, which is actually pretty strong IP. The problem in cell therapy is not IP protection, because it's so hard to set up a manufacturing facility that's compliant and would qualify as a biosimilar, that you don't really even need a patent, and you would get 12 years of marketing exclusivity anyway, as it's a biologic, basically. So the challenge is just manufacturing. The area where you really need to be careful with IP is small molecules and antibodies to some extent as well, but really small molecules, because it's super easy for any process chemist to basically crack your chemical synthesis route and bootleg the drug, as is done in places where US or Western patents are not respected already, like China and India. So yeah, the cell therapy strategy, there are IP attorneys who specialize in this, but I would say it's actually not the number one concern in cell therapy. It's manufacturing. And that's one reason why at ImmuneAGE, we don't actually make cell therapies. We produce the cocktails that you incubate the cells in. We're not engineering the cells. So we're not creating something that would have just a nightmare of regulatory compliance. We're actually developing cell culture reagents that turbocharge and rejuvenate those cells. So we're basically doing both the easy aspect of small molecule drug discovery with the real power, the significant efficacy that you see in cell therapy. So we're trying to get the best of both worlds. Cool. Next question looks like from Gabby.
Yeah, so I was wondering, what's your personal opinion on rapamycin, which arguably seems to be the most promising geroprotector so far? And again, a personal question, if it's not confidential, do you take it yourself?
Sure. So yeah, I agree. Rapamycin has the best data thus far. Should definitely be tried in Alzheimer's disease, for example. I think it has a real shot there. Matt Kaberlin, one of our advisors, has written a review article on this, so I'm really keen to see that happen ASAP. That would be a huge watershed moment for the LongBio field if the first really efficacious drug for Alzheimer's disease which is like threatening the solvency of Medicare, happened to also be a geroprotector that the LongBio field discovered. Like that would be a huge watershed moment for the field. And I think it has a good shot of working based on the underlying biology. Rapamycin, I don't personally take it because I'm sort of holding out for these rapalogs that are in development. So Apollo at Aovian Pharma, we have a rapalog that has reduced side effect profile compared to rapamycin. At Cambrian, we have a portfolio company, Tornado Therapeutics, which is a spin-out from Novartis, and Joan Manick, which is also working on reduced side effect rapalog. So from my own perspective, I think it makes more sense to wait. But if someone is already a bit older or has inflammatory condition, then low dose rapamycin may make sense. But I just presently don't think it's worth the side effect profile given my own personal situation. Yeah, you had another question on epigenetic clocks.
Yes,
to what
yes.
extent are they valid to the point that we can prove geroprotection for specific drugs? Right. So so epigenetic clocks are great when you have a large sample size. So if you have 100 or 1,000 patients, sort of post hoc analysis or prospective study, then it's great. For an individual, it's not that accurate. There's like a 2-year margin of error window in PBMCs, in white blood cells. So you can't really use that for informing your own health choices, right? It's just too long of a delay. There's just a lot of noise. Eventually, maybe we'll get precise enough so that like on a multi-month basis, you could actually get some meaningful statistically significant delta on an n equals 1. But we're pretty far from that. And we have other stuff. Like everyone always reaches for these fancy methods like the epigenetic clocks, but which are also useful in drug discovery, by the way. But we already have stuff like these composite biomarkers where, you know, we have a panel of a bunch of blood biomarkers, inflammatory cytokines, cognitive tests, physical function, VO2 max, all of that stuff that Brian Johnson is doing, you know, is not, I mean, some of it's fancy, but it doesn't have to be fancy. And it actually tells us with pretty high granularity on, you know, maybe a 6 to 12 month basis, how fast we're aging. So yeah, I definitely think that's not as big of a problem as people think as biomarkers of aging. We have pretty good metrics, especially on a population level in the context of a clinical trial, for example.
What protocol do you suggest using for an individual who is trying different stuff, just as Brian Johnson is doing, and just trying to quantify the effects that specific life changes or drugs are producing on himself?
Yeah, well, Brian Johnson, I think, gives a great example of what we can do. It doesn't have to be that fancy. I mean, there are a lot of concierge longevity doctors or functional medicine doctors that will run these panels. The challenge is it's deeper than that, which is not the sensitivity of the tools, but the fact that aging itself proceeds at such a slow pace in humans intrinsically that it's hard to detect, even with the most accurate possible tool, right? So like, you know, there was some data showing that if someone smokes cigarettes for a long time and then they stop smoking cigarettes, that actually they'll kind of catch up, they'll revert back to their prior pace of aging. And so it's just that, you know, in a 1 to 2 year time period, we don't age that much. There may be exceptions if you're under a lot of stress or exposed to toxins or whatever, but generally speaking, we just don't age that fast. And so it's going to be hard to get some kind of biomarker that measures on a multi-month basis, just because there's so much noise there. So yeah, that's a fundamental challenge with measuring the pace of aging. But you may be able to do it with a large enough sample size, like in a clinical trial.
Understood. May I ask my next question, or I have used too much of your
Go ahead.
your time?
Go ahead. No, good questions.
Okay, so I have some very interesting debates with friends and with Adam. I was, by the way, at the convention for Longevity States last week on research and development. So there's this idea that we could extend marginally lifespan and health span with small discoveries, and eventually, if we do this at a high frequency, we could eventually extend the lifespan forever for an indefinite amount of time. However, the other idea is that those kind of research projects are completely different than the ones we should focus on when it comes to radical life extension and indefinite lifespan. What's your insight on this debate?
Yeah, I agree. So as an investor, you kind of want a risk profile spread across these different approaches. So like if you have sort of a layup, low-hanging fruit, then, you know, even if it's not going to extend lifespan by 50% in humans or something, if it's 10%, that's still way more than we have already. And it will prove the concept to the normie traditional pharma world that this is possible. And so I think it's still worth doing. That said, there are a bunch of groups doing that kind of incremental stuff already. And so if you as an individual are not really in it for the money or like low hanging fruit, as low of hanging fruit as any pharmaceutical product can be, then you should be doing the thing that you think is most likely to extend lifespan the most. And that's why I'm doing ImmuneAGE, because I went through the literature over many years and seen all the companies in the space. And I just think rejuvenating the immune system by rejuvenating your own bone marrow stem cells is the lowest hanging fruit, highest potential impact intervention that I can think of that's also very safe because it's autologous. It's your own hematopoietic stem cells, right? So all of that sort of lined up for me. But there are all kinds of other stuff out there. Like one that I think is really interesting is enhancing the fidelity of DNA repair. I spoke about this at the last LBF talk, and you know, it's so clear that DNA repair is one of the central drivers of aging, and very few groups are working on it. And so I think that's an area that's kind of underappreciated from a mechanistic perspective.
Are you talking about sirtuins and the work of David Sinclair?
Well, sirtuins are cool. They mostly regulate metabolism. Sirtuin 6 does regulate DNA repair fidelity. Vera Gorbanova's lab and others have shown this. But that's a little bit indirect. The way sirtuin 6 works is it's an ADP ribosyl transferase. So it basically is recruited by PARPs or it recruits PARPs, and it goes to these sites of DNA damage, recruits PARPs, and then sets off this cascade of DNA repair. So it's sort of surveilling for DNA mutations. And activating sirtuin 6 is probably, I mean, she has pretty compelling data that it's beneficial for lifespan. But that is not exactly what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking more of the machinery that actually twists the DNA and cuts out the DNA, cuts out the lesions and repairs them. And so, you know, like nucleotide excision repair, base excision repair, NHEJ, blah, blah, blah. And there was a cool paper recently of a transcription factor called the Dream Complex from Bjorn Schumacher's group that when upregulated seems to enhance DNA repair fidelity of many of these different subtypes of DNA repair. That's very cool. It's not clear that the Dream Complex is druggable directly or indirectly, but that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. So any other creative ways of enhancing DNA repair fidelity would be really attractive as well.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for your question, Gabby. Abhijit, did you want to ask your question?
Yes. So great presentation. I think it really open a lot of avenues. So my question is about the biomarkers of aging. I mean, you have mentioned like currently about DNA repair, about senescence, about like there are different ones, and the aging is very heterogeneous. Like everyone not age like similarly. Maybe like the people in the US have a different aging parameters than maybe you go to Asia or China or some other places. So to get the drug approved by the FDA, there are still, even in the field also, I don't think that there are people who are like think that okay, these are the aging biomarkers or these are aging biomarkers. Like not everyone is on that. So the typology that you mentioned about like, you know, the 1, 2 and R and different ones, do you think that we can make the FDA like believe or aware of these things so that we'll have at least some way to understand when it goes to clinical trial that FDA would have some way to like approval process would be much more streamlined in there?
Sure. Yeah. So FDA, they have expressed their openness to longevity clinical trials some years ago, which pleasantly surprised me. This was the targeting aging with metformin study, the TAME study. And this is great because they basically signed off on a clinical trial in otherwise healthy elderly people with metformin, which I think is kind of a red herring, but they approved the trial design. And the trial design was the latency from first to second morbidity. So when you get sick with one disease, you're likely to get sick with another one shortly thereafter, because the pace of aging is exponential in nature. So even if we cured cancer, all types of cancer, tomorrow, it would only give about 3 years of extended healthy lifespan on a population level before something else would hit you, because it's an exponential, inexorable process, it seems. So that first to second morbidity latency period, that is the primary endpoint of the study. And that's cool because it's kind of a proxy for aging. So FDA was actually relatively cool with this, and we don't need FDA to basically allow drugs to be prescribed with longevity on the label, because we can get approval in such large-scale indications that basically anyone can get it if they want it, like sarcopenia or metabolic syndrome or frailty or whatever. There's already stuff that you can get a label for the doctors to prescribe. So that's actually, I don't think that's such a big problem. But wouldn't it be great if we had some countries that actually did have longevity on the label and we could already start to innovate here? So I think countries that are kind of forward thinking, like Singapore or maybe Japan or Switzerland or Montenegro, we were just in Montenegro and they were open to this. Certainly Prospera, you can basically take whatever you want in Prospera. So yeah, if we had just a faster sort of generation time, cycle time, like an iteration speed for innovation somewhere in the world, that would generate clinical data that would be sufficiently convincing to get money to finance a clinical trial in these legacy countries, then I think that would be enough to really turbocharge this process.
Yeah, but that again, like it goes back into the same question, that what parameters or biomarkers or different things that we would want to, as a field, we should have, so that we know that, okay, if we use this drug, then the longevity would be like increased, or the health span or the lifespan, and these are the different parameters. It could be anything with the sirtuins or anything with the less inflammation, like less inflammatory markers in it, or some proteomic markers or some metabolic markers or something
Sure.
like that. But
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of clinical trial design, right? Like you can choose whatever you want. The question is it going to convince regulators? And they like to see different things. We already know for sure that FDA is cool with the primary endpoint being first to second morbidity latency. The problem for that is, it's going to take time and a large sample size. I think metformin may not work as we hope if that study gets funded. I would rather see TAME done with rapamycin. I'd rather see the first large-scale longevity study in healthy people done with rapamycin low dose than, or something like super safe, like astaxanthin, or I don't know, many of the different drugs that have been tested in the ITP NIA program. Urolithin A is another good one. So I just think the effect size in metformin is too limited to justify spending 50 million plus on that study, just to detect a tiny effect size. So yeah, to your point, if you can raise money to do a clinical trial in some jurisdiction, you can design it however you want. And there's room for creativity there. But we already have a signal what FDA is looking for. And I think these other regulatory agencies are going to be really keen. Middle East too. Obviously, Saudi is really on board. Dubai, they have aging populations, they have sick, overweight populations, and they don't have time to waste. So they're willing to, get more creative with clinical trial designs.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks for your question, Abhijit. Do we have any other questions? Yes or no? Okay. Oh, we do. Okay. Okay, great comment, Lucas. Yeah. Maybe see you in Rotan. Okay. So I guess other than that, I guess we'll wrap up. I know we're 20 minutes over time. So thank you again, Sebastian, for your fantastic presentation and being so generous with your time. What's the best way for someone here to get in touch with you? And I guess second question is there anything that you're particularly looking for, like any ways that people in the audience can help with any of your projects?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. Always a pleasure to be in LBF. Yeah. So we are looking for companies to invest in Healthspan Capital. We can be your first institutional check. At Healthspan Capital, we're looking for investors. So the minimum check size at Healthspan is pretty small. I think it's $5,000 or less via AngelList. So if you want direct exposure to the LongBio field in a diversified portfolio, you or your colleagues can get in touch. ImmuneAGE Bio, we're raising our seed round now. So if you know investors for ImmuneAGE, happy to talk. We will be hiring an ImmuneAGE, mostly people with backgrounds in immunology and drug discovery. So definitely drop me a line if you're interested in getting involved. And yeah, get involved with Vitalism and Vitalia, our startup city, hopefully future Dubai, Singapore, in the Caribbean, in Roatan. And yeah, happy to provide resources to anybody who is interested in, background on venture capital or biotech. I have this treasure trove of PDFs and articles that I can share with you as well. So yeah, don't be shy. Feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn and I will try to respond promptly.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Sebastian. And yeah, thanks everyone. And we'll see you guys next week. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye guys. Take care.